You ever pop in a game cartridge, all excited to play the arcade hit, only to find out it's about as fun as a root canal? I'm talking about those god-awful arcade ports that were so bad, they made you want to hurl your joystick through the TV screen. We're going on a trip down memory lane, but not the fun kind. We're diving headfirst into the dumpster fire of the absolute worst arcade ports ever made. Get ready to relive the disappointment, the frustration, and the sheer rage of playing these abominations. Oh, Pac-Man on the Atari 2600. A game that promised so much but delivered so little. Where do I even begin with this travesty? It's like opening a beautifully wrapped present only to find a lump of coal inside. This game is the poster child for bad arcade ports. It's the epitome of how to take something beloved and turn it into a nightmare. It's like they took the arcade masterpiece, ran it through a blender, and then tried to piece it back together with Scotch tape and bubblegum. First off, the graphics. Good God, the graphics. They are an abomination. Pac-Man looks like a deformed yellow cheese wheel, a far cry from the iconic character we all know and love. The ghosts resemble flickering squares of paint thinner, lacking any of the charm or menace they had in the arcade version. And the maze? Don't even get me started on the maze. It's a confusing labyrinth that makes no sense whatsoever. It's a jumbled mess that looks like it was drawn by a toddler with a crayon. And the gameplay! Oh, the gameplay! It's slow, clunky, and about as responsive as a sloth on Quaaludes. The controls are so unresponsive that it feels like you're playing underwater. You know the game is bad when even the title screen makes you want to gouge your eyes out. It's a visual assault from the get-go. Atari overproduced this garbage, thinking it would be a license to print money. Boy, were they wrong. They ended up with warehouses full of unsold cartridges. It's like they took a giant dump in a Pac-Man-shaped box and tried to sell it to unsuspecting gamers. The disappointment was palpable. This game is a prime example of how not to port an arcade game. It's a cautionary tale for developers everywhere. It's an insult to the legacy of Pac-Man and a stain on the history of video games. This version is a dark chapter in the otherwise bright history of gaming. Retro gaming enthusiasts often discuss this game as one of the worst ports ever made. It's a topic of endless debate and ridicule. The original Pac-Man brought joy and excitement to millions. But this version? It brought nothing but frustration and regret. The Atari 2600 had its share of great games, but Pac-Man was definitely not one of them. It's a blemish on the console's legacy. When we look back at the history of video games, this version of Pac-Man serves as a reminder of what can go wrong when a game is rushed and poorly executed. Despite its flaws, this game has become a collector's item, a piece of gaming history that serves as a lesson for future generations. Thankfully, Pac-Man has evolved over the years, and we now have versions that do justice to the original arcade classic. But this Atari 2600 version will always be remembered as the ghostly gobbler of quarters that failed to deliver.
Double Dragon, the arcade beat-em-up that let you and a buddy clean up the streets with your fists of fury. It was a game that defined the co-op experience, where teamwork and camaraderie were the keys to success. You and your friend could strategize, cover each other's backs, and share the thrill of victory. The NES port? Well, it took that winning formula and decided to flush it down the toilet. Instead of preserving the essence of what made the arcade version so beloved, it stripped away the very soul of the game. The biggest sin this port commits is stripping away the two-player co-op. Imagine the disappointment of gamers who eagerly brought the game home, only to find out they had to face the mean streets alone. I mean, what's the point of Double Dragon if you can't punch thugs alongside your best pal? The joy of the game was in the shared experience, the high fives after a tough battle, the laughter at the absurdity of the enemies. It's like peanut butter without the jelly, like Mario without Luigi, like Batman without Robin. The dynamic duo aspect was integral to the game's charm. Well, you get the picture.
The absence of co-op play was a glaring omission that left a void in the hearts of fans. And if the lack of co-op wasn't bad enough, the game is plagued with slowdown, flickering sprites, and enemies that disappear and reappear like they're auditioning for a magic show. These technical issues made the game frustrating to play, detracting from any enjoyment that could be had. The arcade version was known for its smooth gameplay and satisfying combat. Every punch and kick felt impactful, and the controls were responsive. This port? It's like trying to fight your way through a bowl of oatmeal. The sluggish controls and unresponsive mechanics made every encounter a chore rather than a thrill. It's slow, clunky, and about as enjoyable as a kick in the shins. The frustration of dealing with the game's shortcomings overshadowed any nostalgia or fondness for the original. Double Dragon on the NES is a classic example of how a bad port can completely ruin a great game. It serves as a cautionary tale for developers and gamers alike, reminding us that not all ports are created equal. The magic of the arcade experience was lost in translation, leaving behind a shadow of what could have been. Chapter 3: Street Fighter II on Commodore 64. Hadouken of Horror. Street Fighter II, the king of fighting games, the one that made arcades great again. It was the game that brought people together, creating a community of competitive players and casual fans alike. The excitement of pulling off a perfect combo, the thrill of a last-second victory, and the sheer joy of mastering your favorite character made it a timeless classic. And then there's the Commodore 64 port, which is like the weird, unwanted stepchild that nobody wants to talk about. It's the version that fans pretend doesn't exist, the one that gets swept under the rug whenever the history of Street Fighter II is discussed. The graphics in this game are so bad, they make the Atari 2600 look like a high-end gaming PC. Imagine expecting the vibrant, detailed sprites of the arcade version, only to be greeted by a pixelated nightmare that looks like it was designed in a rush. Characters are blocky messes, animations are about as smooth as sandpaper, and the backgrounds look like they were drawn by a 5-year-old with a severe case of the shakes. The iconic fighters you know and love are almost unrecognizable, reduced to crude, clunky caricatures of their former selves. And the gameplay? Oh boy, the gameplay. It's a disaster. The controls are sluggish, the response time is abysmal, and every move feels like you're wading through molasses. It's a far cry from the tight, responsive controls that made the arcade version so beloved. It's slow, unresponsive, and about as fun as watching paint dry. Every match feels like a chore, a tedious exercise in frustration rather than an exhilarating battle of skill and strategy. Special moves are a crapshoot to pull off, and good luck trying to execute any kind of combo. The precision and timing required in the arcade version are completely lost here, replaced by a maddeningly inconsistent system that seems to work against you at every turn. It's like the developers took Street Fighter II, sucked out all the fun, and replaced it with a whole lot of frustration and disappointment. The magic of the original is nowhere to be found, leaving only a hollow shell of what once was. This port is a masterclass in how to completely butcher a beloved arcade classic. It's a cautionary tale of what happens when a game is rushed to market without the care and attention it deserves. It's an insult to fighting games everywhere and a reminder that even the mightiest of franchises can fall victim to terrible ports. The Commodore 64 version of Street Fighter II stands as a stark warning to developers: never compromise on quality or risk tarnishing the legacy of a gaming legend. Chapter 4: Mortal Kombat on Super Nintendo. Where'd the blood go? Mortal Kombat. The game that made parents everywhere clutch their pearls and demand stricter video game regulations. The Super Nintendo port? Well, let's just say it's about as edgy as a butter knife. Nintendo, in all their infinite wisdom, decided that blood and gore were too much for the delicate sensibilities of SNES owners.
So they replaced the blood with sweat. Yes, you read that right, sweat. Apparently, in the SNS version of Mortal Kombat, everyone's just really, really sweaty. And the fatalities? Those gruesome finishing moves that made the game infamous? They were toned down so much that they're about as intimidating as a kitten sneezing. Look, I get it. Nintendo was trying to appeal to a wider audience, but come on. Mortal Kombat without the blood and gore is like a horror movie without the scares. It's just not the same. Chapter 5. Space Invaders on Atari 2600. From arcade to atrocity. Space Invaders, the granddaddy of them all. The game that launched 1,000 arcades. The Atari 2600 version? Well, it's like the awkward pixelated cousin that nobody wants to admit they're related to. The arcade original was known for its smooth, addictive gameplay. The Atari 2600 version? It's like trying to play the game through a bowl of jelly. The graphics are blocky and flickery. The sound effects are enough to make your ears bleed, and the gameplay is about as responsive as a brick wall. Look, I get it. The Atari 2600 was a technical marvel for its time, but that doesn't excuse this abomination. Space Invaders on the Atari. 2600 is a stark reminder that even the simplest of arcade games could be butchered in the porting process. Outro. Game over for these ports. So there you have it, folks. 5 of the absolute worst arcade ports ever made. These games are a testament to the fact that just because you can port a game doesn't mean you should. These ports took beloved arcade classics and turned them into unplayable messes, leaving gamers everywhere feeling disappointed and ripped off. What was the worst arcade port you ever played? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to check out our other videos on gaming's greatest hits and misses.